Hello, and welcome to this Global Engagement online series, also known as GEOS, a program of the United Nations Association of the USA. My name is Rachel Bowen Pittman, and I am the Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the USA. Today, I will be facilitating this exciting event, which is being recorded. You will soon hear from our guest speakers, which after they speak, we will have time for questions and answers. If you have questions at any time, please type them into the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your screen on your navigation bar. Selected questions will be read aloud as time permits. Please note that the chat box will not be monitored, but you can access a link for speaker bios within the chat box in just a moment. And now I would like to introduce Peter Yeo, President of the Better World Campaign and Senior Vice President of the United Nations Foundation, who will conduct a conversation on multilateralism under fire with Adam Lupel, Vice President of the International Peace Institute. Peter, welcome.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel, for hosting us today, and for UNA USA for continuing to develop American support and global support for a strong American relationship with the United Nations. I can't think of a more timely subject than to be covering multilateralism under fire. Now, for those of you who work closely on this, you know in the US context, we have a challenge with the US recent withdrawal from the World Health Organization, but also the decisions to defund or withdraw from important organizations like UNESCO, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UN Population Fund, the UN Relief and Works Agency over the past 4 years. So in an American context, we have a challenging situation which, as it relates to the American approach towards multilateralism. But obviously, it's a much broader situation than just the United States. And that's why, frankly, we're really lucky to have with us today Adam Lupel, who's Vice President of the International Peace Institute. The Institute just provides expert coordination and advocacy with the United Nations on so many issues related to global peace and security. And we're really lucky that it's existed as an organization since 1970. And we're lucky that Adam could spend the time with us today to explain what's happening in multilateral organizations and the trends as it relates to how countries are engaging multilaterally and what kind of impact it's having on the issues that we all care about, from peace and security to global health to development. So with that, let me turn it to Adam for some opening comments, and then I'll throw some questions his way, and then we'll take all of your questions. So Adam, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Rachel. That's really a quite kind introduction. So let me just say, I'm going to say a few points about this idea of multilateralism under fire, but also say a bit about IPI. The sense of multilateralism under fire at a time of great need is actually, it's not new. It's something that's been with us for a while, but it does seem that this year in 2020, it has really come to a head, in part because of the circumstances of the coronavirus pandemic, in part because of some of the actions of the United States, as Peter mentioned. But it comes at a curious time for those of us who work around the UN as well, because 2020 was set up to be this great celebratory year, to celebrate the UN, its accomplishments, on the occasion of its 75th anniversary, and to help us to sort of, in recognizing those accomplishments, to look ahead to the next 75 years, so to speak. And I think instead, the context that we're feeling is one of great anxiety and uncertainty about what the future holds. And I'll say maybe a couple words on that in a second. But Peter asked me to say a little bit introducing IPI. You gave a bit of snapshot there. So International Peace Institute, we're an independent not-for-profit think tank. Um, and I'm talking a lot about IPI these days in the context of another anniversary. So it's the UN 75th anniversary. It also happens to be IPI's 50th anniversary. I mentioned that we were founded in 1970. And I think it's relevant to this conversation because we were born out of a moment of geopolitical tension, not unlike the one today, in that when we were founded in 1970, we were founded as a training academy for military and civilian peacekeepers at a time when, because of Cold War politics, it was very difficult to do that within the boundaries of the United Nations. So we were founded by an American philanthropist, Ruth Forbes Young, and an Indian Major General, Indarjit Ricky, in close consultation with Secretary-General Antonio. And so we were set up at a time of gridlock in some ways, similar to today, as an insider-outsider or an outsider-insider, depending upon how you think about it, to help get past some of these institutional problems. We have three pillars of work: research and publications. We're a full-fledged think tank, public events, and then sort of private consultations. And then we have four main programs: peace operations. Peacekeeping is a big part of what we do. Peace and sustainable development, women, peace and security. The gender issue is really important for us. And then our topic for today, revitalizing multilateral cooperation. IP has a long history of working on issues related to multilateral cooperation. You said we advocate. We actually are very careful not to frame ourselves as an advocacy organization, but to the extent we do advocate for anything, it is multilateral solutions to transnational problems. And between 2014 and 2016, we were the Secretariat for the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, which was part of a process to review the multilateral system in the context of the UN 70th anniversary, so five years ago. And it's striking to me how the conversation today is different than it was just five years ago. 5 years ago, the question was, is the UN fit for purpose for the challenges the world is facing? And it was about reform as a response to crisis. Today, I see the conversation around the UN at 75 as more future-oriented. It's about recognizing global transformations and the uncertainty regarding where the international system is heading, and the uncertainty around that has only been exacerbated by the conditions of the pandemic and the evident divisions in the multilateral system that has made a good cooperative response to the pandemic very difficult to do. So many people are beginning to speak about this moment as one of two things in the international system. It is either a moment where long-term trends are just being accelerated, geopolitical division, inequality, rising nationalism, or it is kind of a fork in the road, a moment where there is a possibility to change directions, where we can make real change. And, you know, as often these sort of polemics are, I think it's a bit of both. But what is clear is that the decisions being made today will have real consequences. And so, you know, I think organizations like UNA USA, Better World Campaign, and I'd like to think IPI have a real important task ahead of us in order to work against those trends that threaten multilateral division and work towards better international cooperation. And much of our work in the coming period is geared towards that. I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Adam. And that's a great introduction, not only to what IPI does, but to the broader frame as it relates to the threat to multilateralism that we're currently facing, and frankly, how it's a little bit different than 5 years ago. I want to take a step back for a second and, you know, really ask you, why do we work multilaterally? Why is it important, not just the US, but why do other countries make these multilateral investments as opposed to just trying to tackle everything through effective bilateral diplomatic and economic and security channels. What's the case for working bilaterally?
No, it's obviously a really, really important question, and it's one where you can kind of go big or small. I think in the broadest sense, a multilateral world, a world organized by multilateral cooperation, is a more just world order based upon sovereign equality of states, the rule of law, the practice of diplomacy, and not might makes right, in which a strong country can simply take territory from another country, as you saw for all of human history up until the 20th century. And this, of course, is most important for small countries, for small states, who are often the biggest offenders of the multilateral system. But it's important for people in the United States to realize it's not just for the small countries. The strong also have an interest in this system because it is a more peaceful world. And we all have an interest in peace. There is no doubt statistically that interstate war has been on dramatic decline since the creation of the UN. It is also, I mean, a bit aspirational in the sense that it's only through multilateral cooperation that we can aspire to do the really big things, end poverty, feed the world, combat climate change, advance human rights, all these big things that we're looking to do on a global scale. It's only through the multilateral system that we can even aspire to do that. But then it's also more practical. I mean, it's not just these big idealistic things. It's also about cooperation in our competition, right? It's the multilateral system was not constructed for us to sort of forget about our own individual interests and only focus on the common good. It was constructed for member states to pursue their national interests within a multilateral context in a way that can be more predictable and ordered and based upon cooperation. And a lot of the, when we think about the multilateral system, we have to think about the Security Council and stuff, but a lot of the multilateral system relates to real technical cooperation, civil aviation, or the Universal Postal Union, or telecommunications. All these things have multilateral mechanisms that ease the way for us to do what we think of things that are very, very common, but actually would be very difficult if we didn't cooperate internationally. And then, I think that there's the big problems, and I think today's context of a pandemic is a real case in point. I mean, this is a global phenomenon, and not the strongest country in the world can handle it in an isolation. It's something that we need cooperation to handle, and you see a number of different issues like that: climate change, migration, among others. So there's a whole host of problems that the strongest country in the world can't do on their own. So you need multilateral cooperation to address them.
And so you've made the case for multilateralism.
Oh, good, great. I
want you to make the case for American leadership in multilateral organizations. I recognize that IPI is a global institution, but you're an American, you live in New York. So put on an American hat for a second and tell us a little bit about why American leadership in the UN system matters, and what happens when we leave the stage, when we withdraw from organizations or defund them? What are the ramifications?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really fundamentally important question, and one that is only becoming more and more important. And truth be told, you don't need to put on an American hat to answer that question. Working in the international community, the absence of U.S. leadership in multilateral institutions is lamented, for many reasons. I mean, just in terms of real practical levels, the U.S. is a major financial contributor to all these organizations. And the U.S. is currently in major arrears, and that, as is known, represents over 20% of the funding. And that has a real impact on the ability of the system to function. The UN is in a major liquidity crisis right now. But beyond that, on the financial, which maybe some Americans might see as a burden, it's also about who fills the leadership gap and what effect that has on the shifting priorities of the UN. Working in the UN community, it is very tangible that as the US steps back, China is stepping forward. They are interested in ways in which to use the multilateral system to shift priorities towards their interests. And so that has a real impact. They have different priorities in many ways, or different ways of seeing some of the similar priorities. If you read in Foreign Affairs recently, Stuart Patrick, who I'm sure you know, quoted Richard Holbrooke, the former negotiator U.S., and said that blaming the failures of multilateralism on the UN is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the Knicks lose. The UN is succeeds or fails based upon member state leadership and cooperation. And the US, as the biggest military and economic power in the world, when we withdraw from that leadership and cooperation, it has an effect, and it creates a vacuum, and that contributes to a sense that without the strongest power in the world engaging, it gives a sense of that the system is both a bit rudderless and fragmenting. And in particular, at a time when we have so many crises to deal with, that's a real reason for concern for the whole world, not just for the U.S.
Thank you. And I got one more question for you, and I want to all of our participants. This is your opportunity to submit a question. So please make sure that you're submitting them so that we can turn to some questions from you all right after this one. I want to address this issue about reform and change. Secretary-General, in celebration and commemoration of the UN at 75, has called on dialogues around the world about the world the UN we want in 25 years, when the UN will celebrate its 100th anniversary. And we at United Nations Association of the USA have conducted consultations in all 50 states to make sure that Americans were fully consulted about the issues the Secretary General asked us to tackle. But one of the issues that is being discussed is what kind of reform and change needs to happen at the UN? And as you look over the next decade, what do you think the hot topics are in terms of reform and change to make sure that the UN 10 years from now is more updated and changed and is reflective of the demand from donor countries to make sure that dollars are spent wisely and that programs are effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I said in my introduction, that the conversation today versus 5 years ago is this more forward-looking thing, in part because, it should be recognized that this question of reform and change is a perpetual one at the UN. I mean, Guterres came in, the final years of Ban Ki-moon's term were characterized by a whole process of review and reflection about how the UN should be reformed. And then Guterres, when he came in 2017, instituted a whole reform process. So this conversation now is indeed sort of trying to look ahead. And I think that some of it is a bit more nitty-gritty related to the institution of the Secretariat. Some of it is really, some of the biggest reforms are quite prosaic around issues related to human resources and how to improve the flexibility of hiring and firing practices, reporting lines, and accountability for performance, which is extremely, extremely important. But then it's the big issues about trying to look over the horizon and understand what are the big mega trends that are developing that the UN, if it is going to remain the essential institution for international cooperation, what is it going, how is it going to respond? And, you know, I like to quote Niels Bohr in these sort of issues that the prediction is very difficult, especially when it's about the future. And so I hesitate to predict, but I think it's kind of obvious, frankly, what some of the big mega trend issues are. Issues related to climate change, issues related to technology that the UN has to get better on. Artificial intelligence is on the cusp of having a major international impact. The consequences of inequality in the world and the need for the UN to anticipate the degrees to which that is going to have an impact on peace and stability in the world, but also inclusion in the sense of we are increasingly in a multipolar world in which there are not just the rising powers that we talk about, China and Russia, but a rising middle class around the world and people that are engaged that need to be included. And we need to find a way to include those. So the issue of inclusion, I think, is a really, really important one. And I think the UN at 75 process of these consultations has done a really good job of flagging that. I think, you know, we could keep going on, but I think issues related to how the UN handles peace and security at the institutional level is going to remain constant. The issue of the need for Security Council reform is really pressing and yet also seemingly impossible. But part of it is that there's a growing sense that the UN structure reflects the post-World War II order. But the world has changed and is shifting. And how the UN responds to that change beyond that reflective of a previous order is going to be critically important. And I think that it doesn't have to be just Security Council reform. The way the UN addresses peace and security through other parts of the system is equally important, and maybe even more important.
That's outstanding, thank you. And it's a good reminder of the reform trends and the really big issues that, as challenging as they seem, do need to be tackled in order for the UN to continue to have global credibility, not just among sort of the smaller group of diplomats and the smaller group of decision makers, but broader global credibility. And so reform and change has got to continue to be part of the agenda. So Rachel, I'm going to turn it back to you. I see many questions in the Q&A box. Great.
And because Adam, you just brought up post-World War II, I'm going to start with Ed Elmendorf's question, which is, in this moment, is this a moment comparable to 1944, 1945, when a national dialogue is critical to renew U.S. engagement with the multilateral community? Is it more important to think of U.S. action domestically than to act internationally at this stage?
Answer to the first question, yes. Answer to the second question, no. I mean, or rather, I shouldn't say no. I think they go together. I think one of the differences about the 21st century and 2020 is, especially for a country like the United States, you can't easily separate those two questions out. Many people are sort of pointing to perhaps the coronavirus pandemic as a moment in which the trends of borders becoming firmer, and nationalism, and it's sort of the end of globalization. It's never going to be that simple. Simply because while you might say trade will go down and for a time immigration patterns will slow, the rate of international awareness and connection because of technology, because of climate issues, because of demographic trends is only going to continue. And so our national conversation has to have as a part of it America's role in the world and the impact of global trends on our national self-interest and well-being.
Great. And the next one is a two-part. It's two people that kind of tag teamed. The first question is from Mariel Ali. What policy recommendations should we give our members of Congress when we are making the case for multilateralism and strong US leadership at the UN? And then someone asked, tag teaming to Mariel's question, Heather Fox, what are the top 3 arguments we can make to members of Congress about the importance of multilateral leadership by the US?
I don't suppose I could punt that question to Peter, because I suspect he's much more prepared to discuss the Congress issue. I mean, I could say something. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to know, because the IPI, we don't advocate it in Congress, but I would say just really quickly, one thing is that release the funds. I mean, we need to make do on our commitments, and that's just simply the funding that is a part of our membership in the UN. Congress needs to really push for that. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear what Peter has to say about that. I think you're probably more in tune with that.
Well, I'm happy to raise it, and if I miss anything, Adam, just chime right in, which is that, I think that you have to meet members of Congress where they are as opposed to where you wish they were. So, as always, the best way to communicate effectively with members of Congress about the UN is to understand what issues do they care about. And one of the best parts about the UN is that it tackles almost every issue under the sun, from peace and security to humanitarian to development. And so that's often where we start. So if a member of Congress, for instance, is focused on global terrorism and the rise of terrorist groups, we'll focus on peacekeeping and what peacekeeping can do in post-conflict and conflict situations. And we might talk about the role of UNESCO in promoting effective education around the world to give hope to a generation of young people so that they don't feel like they have no other option than to join extremist groups. If somebody cares about humanitarian, we'll talk about the UN's role, the work of the World Food Program in making sure that people are fed in some of the worst crises around the world, including in Yemen. And then if they care more about the development side of the house, alleviating long-term poverty, we can talk about really the role of the UN broadly in moving families from dependence to sustainability, and the really exciting trend in the UN, which is making sure that all of the UN fund programs and agencies are actually working as a team on a common plan in conjunction with the government, the host government, in a way that they really haven't been doing before. And that's a new reform. That's a change. And people that actually run these country teams actually report to the Deputy Secretary-General. It's really an exciting reform for those of us nerds who do this for a living. And I think that to pick up on a point that Adam made earlier as to what happens when we don't lead, what are the consequences when we fail, we withdraw and fail? First of all, countries like China, which doesn't necessarily always share our values in the UN system, they fill the gap. And so the concept that the US will defund an organization and some other organization will go away, or that the UN will say, oh my gosh, we're so sorry we offended you. Please, what can we do to make you happy? It just doesn't work that way. The UN is reflective of its member states. And so it's got to have a much broader perspective and try to meet the needs of a lot of different member states. And so what will happen is, from a funding perspective and a policy perspective, other countries fill the gap. And that's frankly not consistent with American interests. How we talk about the UN and the US in Washington is very different than in New York. Because in Washington, we're talking about how the UN serves American interests. But obviously, that isn't necessarily the best talking point in New York.
Oh, great.
Great. Next question. What do you think is the most powerful argument against nationalism, isolationism, and fear of other xenophobia that we are seeing sweep across the globe?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think, in my view, it's really important to understand that nationalism and isolationism are not necessarily the same thing. That is when I said in the beginning that the multilateral system was constructed so that member states can pursue their national interests within the context of a global frame. So when we talk about the opposition between the pursuit of national interest and multilateral cooperation as somehow opposed, it's a false dichotomy. But if nationalism means isolationism and a go it alone, I think that from a international perspective, it is a problem because it won't lead to a safer, secure, more prosperous nation. It will actually lead to an impoverished and more insecure nation because there are a host of problems that can only be addressed with the pursuit of cooperation. And then I think from just taking a step back on the question of xenophobia, you know, as an institute that studies peace and conflict, I think that you can identify conflicts throughout history in which xenophobic discourse grafts onto ethnic and social divisions domestically that cause internal conflict to rise. And so it's a recipe for internal conflict as well as external conflict.
Thank you. Peter, this might be for you. This is around elections. I'll give you two questions. I'll bundle them. One's from Barry Simon. How do you see the U.S. engaging with the world, or the world engaging with the U.S. if in November A, a new president is elected, or B, the current president is reelected? And then another question around this issue is, how important do you think the upcoming election will be to impacting the American government leaning towards or away from multilateralism in support of the UN?
Yeah, very similar questions. This election will have a tremendous impact upon American foreign policy, including its relationship with the United Nations and other multilateral organizations, in a way that I've never seen before in terms of the impact on the United Nations. I think that if we of course, as a reminder, we're a nonprofit like IPI, and so we don't have a position as it relates to political candidates. So what I'm offering is my analysis of what the candidates have said or done related to international organizations. Vice President Biden, while he was vice president and while he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and a senator from Delaware, took a number of steps to demonstrate his commitment to the UN. One of the most interesting ones was when he was vice president, he hosted a session at the United Nations that was designed to get other countries to make new commitments to UN peacekeeping. And it was incredibly successful in terms of getting countries to come at the head of state level and the deputy head of state and foreign minister level to actually say, here, listen, this is what the government of Denmark is willing to do moving forward in terms of increasing their commitments, not only financially, but through the contribution of technology and troops to UN peacekeeping. And it was really exciting to see Vice President Biden hosting that. But of course, when he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, or ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, he was the one that negotiated the Helms-Biden package that resulted in over $1 billion in overdue bills being paid to the UN. So throughout the whole process and the campaign, recent campaign, we have seen the Vice President indicate a strong desire to work multilaterally. He just tweeted out that should the, on day one of his administration, the US will rejoin the World Health Organization. So President Trump has at times indicated his commitment to working with the United Nations, and he maintains a very close relationship with the Secretary-General on a wide variety of issues, including on national security and foreign policy issues. And both Nikki Haley and Kelly Craft, as U.S. Perm Reps to the UN, have at times taken very constructive approaches to Security Council debates and, on important issues reflective of particularly what's happening in Africa and instability there. But obviously, we have seen the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, and the defunding of UNRWA, the World Health Organization, and UNFPA. So we have a situation where the administration's commitment to these multilateral organizations has been a challenge. I would say if the president were to be reelected, we'll see more of that with additional UN organizations and multilateral organizations either being withdrawn from or defunded. But obviously it's hard to predict where the second Trump administration would look like, because we don't really know the personnel that would be at the highest levels in the administration. Thanks.
And I think your answer can lead into this next question, which is, what do you think has been the largest negative impact on the American view of multilateralism within the past 10 years?
Adam, I'm going to leave that one for you.
What has happened that has led Americans to have a negative view of the multilateral system? Is that right?
Read it again.
I mean, I think.
Yeah. So the question was, what do you think has been the largest negative impact on the American view of multilateralism within the last 10 years?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that the UN often does quite well in Poland. There is quite a bit of support for the UN amongst in the American public, and that's across party lines. It's not just sort of a Democrat issue. As a matter of fact, I mean, historically, support for the UN was very much a bipartisan issue, and it's really, really important to emphasize. But I do think that there is a tendency to, as the world, the globe, has transitioned from that unipolar moment immediately post-Cold War to a multipolar world. I think there is a sense that there are other interests at play within multilateral systems that maybe don't exactly jive with the U.S. position, and so it's being seen as sort of not our place anymore. For all the reasons that we've discussed before, I think it's very important to educate the American public, have conversations with the American public about the ways that changing nature of the world is not going to go away if we retreat from the United Nations. Actually, that we're just going to cede ground, and that vacuum will be filled by those exact powers that we are seeing advancing their priorities, and we need to actually step up and compete and advance our interests within these institutions. And I think actually the WHO is a very important point. I mean, if part of the rationale for withdrawing from the WHO was that the WHO is doing the bidding of China too extensively, to withdraw from the WHO doesn't solve that problem. Actually, it gives China more strength within the World Health Assembly. But it's not just political. I mean, I think that the UN, I'm an advocate for the UN, I'm a supporter of the UN, but the UN has its problems. We've in peacekeeping, there's been real problems with sexual exploitation and abuse. You had the cholera episode in Haiti, going back to the oil to food crisis in Iraq. So there's been scandals, I think, that have contributed to this this sense. But I don't think those should distract from the real benefits that U.S. participation within the multilateral system would bring the U.S. Public at large and the world.
Great. And then someone also asked, given the receding U.S. leadership at the global level, do you think that it can regain leadership in the future, or do you think, which you kind of talked about, or do you think other countries will fill the void and permanently change the global leadership dynamics moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really fundamentally important question, and it does require some crystal ball viewing, which which makes me nervous. But I think one thing that is important is, as I said earlier, there is our allies would like the U.S. to come back and show leadership on international cooperation issues. They're not waiting for the U.S. France and Germany have started this alliance for multilateralism. They're looking to lead and such. So they're not waiting, but they would like the U.S. to return to leadership. That being said, I don't think we can expect, as some people have said, that if a more pro-multilateral administration comes in next year, it's not going to be a snapback to normal. Things have changed. And the foreign policy that is instituted on day one in the next administration does have to recognize that. And part of this is a recognition globally that support for multilateralism and for these agenda is not, there's not a bipartisan consensus about that in the United States. So even if the super pro administration comes in, there'll be hesitance to fully commit by some of people around the world, because they don't know that maybe the US could do a 180 with the next term. And it's not like that in many countries around the world. I confess, we have, IPI works with 30 some different we work with the whole membership, but we have about 30 different donors every year, member states. And we work with the UN missions, and frankly, I often don't notice when there's a change of government in countries, because the policies of the member states at the UN don't really change that much based upon the change in government, and that helps diplomacy because there's a consistency and predictability, and I think there's a broad worry that the U.S. has lost that. No matter who comes into the office, and that's something that we're going to have to work on.
I agree with that. I would just put a finer point on the U.S. side, which is if there is a change in administration, my sense is that the new administration, the new Biden administration, would have a series of day one issues that would be much more snapback to where it was before the Trump administration, And in that category, things like rejoining certain organizations would probably fit into that, right?
Yeah.
Like, or WHO or UNESCO. But then there's a broader spectrum of diplomatic issues and diplomatic approaches that will require some learning and some humility and some time to ensure that this next administration doesn't just pick up where the Obama administration left off. There's been 4 years of diplomatic developments. So it's going to have to be more nuanced and different than just picking up from 4 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right.
So the next 3 questions about taking action, I'll give you the first one and bundle the following 2. The first one's from Marsha Brewster. How can the UNA, USA, and IPI make their voices heard on the importance of multilateralism for peace and climate action, et cetera, when the State Department and other US institutions such as EPA have been disseminated by this administration?
Well, I mean, sort of what is IPI's strategy to get these issues out? I mean, I mentioned earlier on about the kind of work that we do in terms of research and publications, public events, and closed door strategic advising. Something that's interesting that's happened, and I think this event is a case in point, is IPI in the past, our convening was very much focused on the physical location of the UN. We have this event space that looks out across the UN there on 44th and 1st Avenue. It's one of our, we've always considered it one of our great added values. And in the process of the pandemic, everybody working from home said, this isn't IPI, this is my living room. We've also transitioned to do a lot of virtual convening. And what has happened is, in many respects, we're reaching new audiences and bigger audiences in many ways. And I think moving forward, what's going to have to happen is to understand when we need to take advantage of these new formats to reach that broader audience, when we should kind of focus on more in-plug decision makers in person, whether it's closed door advising or public convening, when to step on the pedal, when to draw back, and it's really a strategic question. But I think on a more substantive policy direction, I think it will require, touching a bit on something Peter said, is to further develop this point that the UN system has to work across institutional silos, so that there's an understanding that these environmental issues have an impact on peace and security, have an impact on economic development, have an impact on trade, and all of these things that the U.S. government, considers its priorities, and that these things are all interconnected, and so communication, work towards making that better understood is a really important part of it.
Great. And once again, I'm going to bundle these 2 questions. The first one is, how can we be more effective in having conversations about the importance or benefits of multilateralism with those who are more focused on the local or national level? And then what can youth do to help the situations that are happening?
Great. This gives me an opportunity to plug an event we're having tomorrow on localizing the Sustainable Development Goals, localizing the 2030 agenda. It's interesting, actually, this conversation, we haven't actually talked much about the Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And I think it's a really important piece of the equation on how we're going to respond to the current environment. We're going to respond to the pandemic and everything. And the local level there is so important. And when we say the local, we're not just talking about, you know, national actors. We're talking about cities. We're talking about civil society activists, teachers, and trying to understand how these global discourses can translate down, and how we can learn from what is happening at the local level to make connections to the international agenda is really, really important. And the youth are the key to that process because it's the young people that are most connected to kind of the new ways of talking and doing. I mentioned earlier that one of the key sort of themes for UN reform moving forward is inclusion, and trying to understand how mechanisms of inclusion can be improved. And there's a lot of discussion about how to better include youth conversations in that. And there's youth representatives and youth special envoys that are doing some of this work. And it's really important to listen to them and to bring them into these conversations as best as we can. So tomorrow, though, if you go to IPI's website, www.ipinst.org, you can get information about this event that we're having tomorrow online, of course, on localizing the 2030 agenda. There's my plug. Did I lose you, Rachel? Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, Rachel, hello?
Sorry,
Oh.
also need it. I said, I think we can squeeze in 2 more questions. The first one is you, Adam. Does IPI work hand in hand at all with U.S. Institute of Peace?
We get confused with USIP quite a bit. And we've partnered with USIP for events in New York, and we've sort of, there's been some cross back and forth between researchers, consultants, and such, but we're very separate organizations. You know, USIP, as you know, is a congressionally funded, U.S. congressionally funded organization, and IPI is an independent institution that is, as I mentioned, is funded by 30-some different member states and foundations and others, and so we're independent from USIP, and you know, we look to work with them. But yeah, no, we're not closely associated.
Thank you. And I think this is a great closing last question is for both of you from Giovanni Desir. When do you think the world will be completely multilateral? And do you two believe that the COVID-19 aftermath will begin the process of multilateralism in the globe? Why or why not?
I'll go first. I'm a little bit more pessimistic. You know, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has both demonstrated the opportunity of multilateralism, but also its limits. Because in the case of the WHO, you know, there was a hope and a criticism of the WHO that it should have had the ability to immediately detect what was actually happening in China. And if it had that ability, it could have had a transformative impact in terms of the global response. And the reality is no country, including the United States or China or anybody else, really wants the WHO to have that role, really wants the WHO, a multilateral organization, to have the ability to truth tell as to what's actually happening in countries around the world. And when you don't have that political consensus among not just the US, but every country around the world to not empower a multilateral organization in that manner, it has this limiting impact on the ability of a multilateral UN organization to have that transformative impact. And as a result, that organization, in this case the WHO, gets exposed to criticism of, why didn't you do better? Why didn't you truth tell? And it's in part because of the limits the member states have placed on them. So I think it's always going to be a real balance of a tension between trying to empower and strengthen multilateral organizations because we recognize their transformative impact and their ability to collect resources and collect our common strengths towards a common good. And yet at the same time, we're all, not just the US, but most of the other larger countries in the world will always really want to put their own national interests and their bilateral relations up equal plane with our multilateral investments. So I think it's always going to be a tension. It's always going to be a balancing act. And that's probably healthy, that people recognize that sometimes bilateral initiatives can work just fine. It doesn't always have to be multilateral.
Great. I think you're absolutely right, and I think it points to a common misunderstanding that is often revealed by people's criticism of multilateral institutions, right? Why didn't you do better? Why didn't you do X? And it's a way of thinking about the UN, whether it's the UN or the WHO, as sort of some sort of independent organization that has the freedom to act how it acts, as opposed to really a system by which countries work to through diplomatic channels to manage competition and advance common interests. And that sort of geopolitical tension is always going to be there. And looking into the crystal ball and thinking about the global trends, I think there's no way avoiding the fact that we are entering into, we have entered, and we are entering into a period of heightened geopolitical competition because of the US-China relation, because of the assertiveness of Russia, but also other issues as at play. And so when will we be fully multilateral? I think what we have to expect is that there's going to be this tension, this sort of competition. But the point is that we need to do everything that we can that geopolitical competition happens within a multilateral framework, because it's only that way that it will be could be a productive tension as opposed to a destructive tension. One point on the impact of the coronavirus on these questions and the impact of the pandemic beyond just the attacks on the WHO. I think it's very important to recognize that if we are maybe at the end of the beginning of this thing, we're nowhere near the beginning of the end. And the effects of the pandemic are only going to be rippling out and into other domains. We're already seeing it in the economic sphere. It's becoming evident in the humanitarian sphere, on sustainable development. And as those ripple effects become increasingly evident, the multilateral system is going to be increasingly engaged on the response. And I think that's going to become increasingly evident. It has to become increasingly evident. And so this initial fear in which everybody put up the gangplanks and pushed out the world is I believe is going to have to soften, and cooperation on the response to this crisis is going to increase. And how we handle that, how we navigate that, is going to be really, really important in the coming period. And stay tuned. It's something to watch and to participate in.
Thank you. And I think that ends the Q&A part of our session today. Peter, do you have any closing remarks?
Just thank you all for participating. Thank you, Adam. It's really nice to have that sort of substantive engagement with Americans from all around the country to really understand the complexities of the UN and complexities of where we're headed as an organization. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for enlightening us. And again, thank you to Rachel and UNA for hosting us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Peter and Adam, for this conversation today. And in the spirit of the International Peace Institute's 50th anniversary and the United Nations 75th anniversary, I think we all must continue to protect the need for multilateralism to make real advances on critical issues like global health, climate action, and world peace. And we would like to give everyone the opportunity to advocate for the most important multilateral organization, the United Nations, by contacting your member of Congress to encourage strong US leadership in the UN, as well as full US funding for the UN. And you can do this by texting USA FORUN to 738-674. And also, there are many more ways that you can take action as a member of UNA USA. When you join UNA USA, you are joining 20,000 other Americans around the country who know the importance of the UN and understand that we need the UN to make our world more just, healthy, and fulfilled. And you can learn more by going to unausa.org. And finally, I hope you join us for more GEOS events, like next week's session on exacerbating gender gap, COVID-19's impact on women and girls. And lastly, in closing, I want to sincerely thank our guest speakers, Peter Yeo and Adam Lupel, and also to Farah Eck, our Senior Director of UNA USA, for putting this program together. But most of all, thank you for joining us today. And I wish you all good health and happiness until next time. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.